Hi and welcome to another episode of the Leadership Enigma, and this is part of the CEO Series. Now we know, don't we, as we're navigating and hopefully pulling through a global pandemic, I know I've been talking about this for months, but we can't ignore it, that we're really trying to live and lead in disruption. So it's absolutely wonderful that you're going to come back to me, and I'm going to be speaking to SatinderPal Singh, who's the CEO of Adani Total Private Limited, currently based in India. And we're going to hear about his story and about how do you live and thrive through disruption. So come back to me just after this.
You're listening to the Leadership Enigma, powered by Transform Performance International, a podcast for the insatiably curious to explore the power of human-centered leadership to create real momentum for positive and sustainable change. Whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, or corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts, and disruptors as we discover that success leaves clues. Now, here's your host, Adam Pacifico.
There we go. How about that for an introduction, SP? You've got to be mildly impressed with that, I'm hoping.
Oh, I'm thoroughly impressed. Thanks for having me, Adam.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. We spoke, I know, about a month or so ago, so I just want to say a big thank you for carving out the time to join me on the Leadership Enigma. It is great to see you and hope you are well. And I know we're going to come back because I know you're relocating at the moment from Dubai to India, so we're going to come back to that. So let's start with the current role that you have, because then we're going to go backwards to come back to present day. Current role you have, CEO of Adani Total Private Limited. Just give us a bit of an overview of that current role and how long you've been in that position, SP.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I've been in that role for a little over 2 years now. And essentially, this is a 50-50 joint venture between Total SA of France and the Adani infrastructure conglomerate in India. It effectively is a joint venture in the liquefied natural gas (LNG) sector, focused on developing infrastructure and market pull for the global LNG portfolio of Total in the country. And essentially, we've got 2 LNG terminals on either side of the coast of India that are under various stages of development. And we have a small but growing presence in the gas marketing space in the country. And we're also looking to diversify and grow in the neighboring regions of Bangladesh, etc.
Right, gotcha. And SP, just help people if they haven't heard or they don't know about the Adani conglomerate in India, because that is a force to be reckoned with in itself, isn't it? So just help the listeners understand that aspect too.
Yeah, well, the Adani Group is a relatively young company, which is totally focused on developing world-class infrastructure in the country. A very large and formidable presence in the port sector,
yep.
But also very fast-growing presence in utilities, whether it's power, transmission, gas, solar, etc.
Now, I'm always incredibly interested, insatiably curious, as you know, of the journey to where you are. And obviously incredible that you're in this particular role at the moment, have been for a couple of years. But obviously you didn't start as the C-suite. You didn't start as the CEO. You started from simpler beginnings when we're all thinking, what should we do with our life and what should we study and what experiences do we want to try and gather? So give me a little bit of a background of your journey to this point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most of us, whether we admit it or not, do stumble upon our calling rather than sort of dive headlong knowing that we're going to land there. Yeah. My situation was no different. I started off work as a quality control officer for a bottling plant for Pepsi in Tanzania after having graduated in chemistry from India. I did that job for 2 years, couldn't imagine myself in a white lab coat for the rest of my life. Tried to do some other things in Africa, didn't really work out. Did the time and tested thing of going and getting myself an MBA, was in Australia, near Melbourne doing that. Came back, worked as a management consultant for the Tata Group for 3.5 years, I think it was.
Yeah.
And in 97 September, I joined Shell, the oil and gas company, and I was with them for 19 years in different parts of the world. And the last one being Dubai, as you mentioned. And then I moved into this role. I joined the Adani Group about 4.5 years ago and moved into this role about 2 years ago.
Right, gotcha. Now, I know for a fact that you've worked incredibly hard and you've strived and you've juggled and you've had to battle with competing things going on in your life. Let's go back to the MBA days, because there, even during that time, you were juggling, weren't you? And you were trying to make ends meet and make sure that you could do everything that you needed to do all at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, you have to understand that this was 1992, and India was just about sort of coming out into the world, as it were. And as a full fee paying international student, you pretty much have drawn on very extensive resources from back home
Yes.
to make ends meet for the MBA. And it was really, for me, it was a great lesson in humility, that as an MBA student, I was actually also a tutor for third year undergrad students. And I was getting paid fairly well for that, but I needed more sources of income. So I'd also taken up a job as a dishwasher. And once a week, the timings were such that I would finish my tutoring role and then run through my car, pick up my sort of tracksuits, etc., go to the dishwashing station, and I'd be washing dishes for the same kids that I was tutoring just a few minutes ago.
Right.
And coming from the culture that I did find it strange initially, but to my very pleasant surprise, I actually found that these undergrad kids were so impressed by what they clearly saw as a determination and dedication from someone who's come from overseas and is doing everything possible to hang in there and make ends meet. And I think that's one of those lessons that really stayed with me till this day. And I think it shapes to some extent how I approach my work.
And when we first chatted, it was immediately obvious to me that there's a big part of the human-centered leader in you. That was obvious within a couple of minutes. And is it experiences like that and humble experiences like that, SP, that stay with you and come out in how you lead now as a CEO of a large organization? Do you find that you draw from those humble experiences?
Without a doubt, whether I think of it every day or not, but I do believe completely that somewhere in my subconscious mind, that is ingrained. Whether it is, I mean, I'll find it completely normal to do things that, from a cultural aspect, it may seem strange in some parts of the world. And, I mean, there's really nothing that is, how should I say it in a nice way? It's too menial, or
Yeah.
let's leave that bit out again. I'll start again.
Okay.
So I think what is important is that every experience shapes you in a certain way, and this experience of humility is definitely that stayed on with me in the subconscious for sure. And it shapes how I approach work, how I approach people more than
Yes.
anything else. There's a certain desire to connect with people at all levels of the organization,
Right.
which, had I not had experiences like the one I just described in Australia, maybe I could have chosen to be a somewhat more of an aloof person now that I'm at the sort of top of the food chain, as it were.
Yes.
But I think having kind of transcended that entire gamut of work streams, you just do become a bit more empathetic in how you connect with people across the organization.
So SP, that warms my heart, because I'm passionate about human-centered leadership. So when you talk about having reached the top of the summit, it's important to communicate with everyone in the business. It's important to remain humble. It's important to understand where you've come from and utilizing those experiences to be a force for good. I think that's why I was so keen and passionate for us to have this conversation as part of the Leadership Enigma. I want to ask you another question, because I was making a list. Now, I know this isn't going to be an exhaustive list, because you mentioned Tanzania, India. You're currently in India. I know that your family are packing up in Dubai to come and join you in India. So you've been there for many years, and you talked about Australia. I'm bound to be missing countries that you have lived.
Mexico, yeah.
Okay, Mexico as well. I'm writing that in as well. And the question I want to ask you is, tell us a little bit about the experience of working in different regions and in different cultures, and what that's given you to be able to lead people across cultures and across levels, because there's a real diversity of thought piece here, isn't there? And the inclusivity piece. So any thoughts you've got about how you've benefited or what you've got from working across so many different regions and cultures?
It's funny you ask this question. So I was just talking to a colleague the other day, and I was just mentioning that, whether it's the chest thumping of people in Mexico, or it's the rather reticence of people in India in how they approach relationships at work.
Yes.
They are actually two sides of the same coin. Culturally, whilst the geography, the history of where you live has obviously deeply impacted people's approach to work.
Yes.
But equally, at the end of the day, it is incumbent on you as a manager, or you as a team leader, player, whatever it is, to try and understand what those differences are, and make something out of it that is still unified and appears homogenized. Because it is. So I'll give you a simple example.
Sure.
In Mexico, when I was there, I was rather intrigued initially by the rather aggressive way with people would first sort of interact with you. And I come from a culture, in India, where people are relatively, like I said, reticent.
Yes.
And I found it strange at first, but only to realize later that that's typically how people in Mexico would want to size you up. Are you a man of your word? Are you able to stand up and engage with them in an upright manner?
Right.
And I think once you got over that initial hurdle, people were lovely. People were extremely warm and effusive. Now, if you go there with only a certain mindset of how people should be, then of course you may end up drawing the wrong conclusions. Having worked for an Anglo-Dutch company, I can tell you that even within Europe, the difference in working styles between the English and the Dutch is, for someone from a neutral culture, was fascinating to watch.
Yes.
And fortunately, I was able to really draw upon the best of both cultures. And I can tell you, again, if you were to be blind to that, you may end up again with a suboptimal result. So I think it's very important to know the ethos of the people you're dealing with, but then equally, that's not an end in itself to know the ethos. I think the end is to be able to blend it into something that works as a beautifully synchronized machine, and I think it has been a privilege to, in my industry and the kind of companies I've worked with, it has actually been a great privilege to be part of teams that are geographically and culturally very dispersed. And it's wonderful when it comes together, like a real fantastic orchestra, and you can make things happen. And it's been just great to see that.
SP, I've had a multitude of jobs, but they've all really been based here. And it's only in the last 4 or 5 years where I've traveled the world and I've had the opportunity to work with leaders and organizations from across the world. And it's been such a rich set of experiences. I'm not living to regret, but I do wish I'd done it earlier. And in fact, I have a couple of teenagers, and one of my, I hope, pieces of advice that they take is go and explore, go and experience other cultures. And then by all means, come home and find what it is that you want to do, but go and have that rich experience. You mentioned something which I just want to tap into, and I call it authenticity in context. You're an authentic leader, and that's something that people will always look for, authenticity in a leader. But is it fair for me to say that when you travel to another region, when you find yourself immersed in a completely different culture, you've still got to modify your authenticity in order to be appropriate within the culture? You've got to be authentic in the context of the culture that you find yourself. because it's one size just won't fit all, as you say. What you do in the UK may not be appropriate in the Netherlands, may not be appropriate in Dubai, may not be appropriate in India, so on and so forth. So authenticity in context of where you find yourself. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think, if you were to look at it as peeling off the layer of peeling off an onion,
Yeah.
I think the authenticity is really something that's sitting in the essence of it all, right in the heart of that onion. And what you're peeling off, the outer layers, are really the societal appropriateness of things. And without a doubt, it is extremely important to be culturally aware. Again, as a example, I almost got myself killed in Mexico because I was stopped by the police on the highway, and I, like a dutiful Indian citizen used to getting out and being respectful to policemen, I got out of my car to ask the police why I was stopped. And of course, these guys went bananas because that's a real no-no in North America, right? In most parts of the world.
Yes.
You are supposed to just stand immobilized, sit defenseless in your car with your hands on the steering wheel. So, but that is the outer layer of the onion, right? I mean, the inner layer is, I was an honest man. I didn't have anything to hide. The police asked me all these questions and they were satisfied and I went my way.
Yeah.
So I think that's the difference I would draw, is that the authenticity does not change where you are. But the manner in which you approach your day-to-day life and your relationships, of course, are influenced. I mean, if you are in Dubai during Ramadan, you'll surely behave not in a manner as if you were walking into a pub in London in a bright sunny day. You have a slightly different demeanor about you. But I don't think that changes me as a person. That's just me being culturally aware.
Yeah, and
Does that help?
Yeah, I love that answer, and I love the the explanation to unpeeling of the onion. And it's, in some ways, it's your ability to sense make also the environment you find yourself in, which takes me to something else you and I have discussed before as well, and that's leading and living. Let's be honest, because our work and our home has in some way become morphed very tightly, so that they're inextricably linked, more so than ever. Mm-hmm. Living and leading through disruption. You're currently in India. You've been in Dubai for over a decade. The family are, as you say, about to move with the 3 dogs, I should mention. We're both dog lovers. So what are some of the things that you've taken notice of from leading both self and also maybe leading others around you? What are some of the things that you're seeing, or some of the challenges you're grappling with leading and living in disruption?
Look, the pandemic, of course, is a very acute and a very typical sort of disruption. But disruption, I think, is all around us. Yes. In the kind of work that I do, I can tell you that disruption happens because you work on these large projects. You can spend a couple of years working on one, and then you just don't meet the threshold criteria for investment, and all your hard work of a few years can just go down the tube one fine day, and you're disrupted. You've got to go and find yourself a new geography to do a project in, and you've got to start all over again. Or your boundary conditions change, and now it's a different kind of project, or whatever. So I think disruption, what we're seeing in this pandemic, is something very is something very unique. But at the same time, disruptions have always been around us. Yeah. And my own view is I would focus on communication as one of the key things that will help anyone dealing at a time of disruption and uncertainty, because over communication is something that can only help, I feel, when done rightly, of course. So for instance, during this time, what we started was an initiative where roughly every fortnight we do a session called Learning with Leaders, where even though people are in working from home, etc., we dial into a team session, and everyone has got something to contribute. Every fortnight there is a leader. Really does not depend on the seniority, but the skill set of the person.
Understood.
And such individual will present an hour-long session, and we get to ask questions. And what it does is it brings a feeling of community back, which we start to miss, and it creates that inclusiveness and warmth amongst the team, which I think is very important. So we've been doing that over the pandemic, and it's been amazingly successful. I think the second thing which I would say is to remain transparent.
Okay.
I mean, I have really never been an individual to uh, to sort of believe in some of the very traditional minded sort of approaches to work, which is, you need to come in and you need to be in office to be seen to be doing work, etc. I mean,
Yep.
and I think that approach has really helped us during this pandemic, because we anyway were not insistent in any way on people um, being in office. There are a lot of people, we travel a lot in our jobs, our team, so we are anyway used to working quite remotely often. But at the same time, we have also because that's acceptable, I find what it has done for people is to be very truthful and honest with each other.
Right.
That, today I'm at such and such place, so I won't be able to join such and such because I'm doing such and such. So that transparency in communication is something which I think is very helpful as well. And I would say that when you're leading through disruption, those two things at least are the top two things that come to my mind. There's several other aspects, but I would focus on those two.
No, that's great. Thank you. And one of the things that also stands out for me as I listen to that, SP, is an element of vulnerability now within leaders, perhaps an element of vulnerability in all of us. Because I spoke to, I think I've said this on a podcast episode before, I'll say it again, I spoke to one of the doctors in India, and she quite rightly, she said, listen, we're all suffering through the storm, but we are in very different boats. And perhaps this was at the height of when things were more than just problematic in India. And I thought that was a very compelling way of describing it. But vulnerability keeps coming up as well, SP, and the vulnerability of leaders. And someone used the phrase, time to take the mask off, and now be quite not only self-aware, but be brutally candid about how people have felt and how individuals have felt and dealt with the pandemic and how others are feeling. So I just wanted to ask you any thoughts or reflections on the issue of vulnerability as well.
Yeah, again, I can respond to that in 2 or 3 different ways. Let me try and be brief on it.
Sure.
I think vulnerability, I think as a CEO, if you don't really feel vulnerable ever so often, I think there's something wrong.
Yep.
Because the one thing that I have seen in my limited time in this position is that you sometimes actually feel quite helpless, because you are so dependent more than ever before in delivering through others. So you are constantly calibrating the skill sets of your team, the composition of different groups. Have you set the bar high enough?
Yes.
Have you given enough time? So I think that creates a lot of vulnerability. Whereas if you are sort of in a rather limited task and asked to execute, some of those aspects you don't get concerned with, because you have a rather limited scope. You just do that. But as your scope gets bigger, the uncertainties go up, the degrees of freedom are higher, and therefore the vulnerability, I feel, inevitably creeps in, whether people express it openly or not. I think that's point number one.
Right.
I think point number two that I would make is that during this pandemic, accepting the vulnerability has been very empowering, because what it has done is it has allowed for us to have, as a team, very honest conversations with us,
Right.
with each other. And because you actually talk with that honesty, what I find is that that's developed a sort of a kinship between people. And without that kinship, the amount of progress that we have been able to make despite the pandemic in the project that we are executing would simply not have been possible.
Right.
So I, in fact, find now vulnerability does not mean paralysis. Just because you're vulnerable, that you're now sort of just paralyzed into inaction. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying accepting vulnerability in yourself and others is a great way forward to actually create the feeling of kinship, develop trust, and actually ask people to go outside their comfort zone and do far beyond what they are expected to do in a 9 to 5 situation, simply because they know that by your honesty and your forthrightness, you have their back.
Yeah. I mean, SP, I love that as an answer. And sometimes it's difficult, isn't it? I'm speaking for myself now, where there have been significant challenges through the pandemic, but also, as you've just eloquently described, there are some things that we've done or some behaviors that we've changed, which will stand us in good stead if we carry them forward to a post-pandemic environment. Because as you've also rightly said, then there'll be something else after this. It'll be another great change of some sort. Maybe for us, it'll be Brexit. And then it'll be something else and something else. It's never going to stop, is it? This constant change in our environment is not going to go away. So these are maybe powerful lessons learned.
See, in the oil, in my sector, the oil and gas industry, well, change is upon us like never before. You've got this increasing pressure coming in from renewables. You've got increasing pressure for reducing your carbon footprint.
Right.
So the oil and gas sector is not going to be what it was, maybe even 10 years ago. It is irrevocably changed, and disruption is upon us. Pandemic or no pandemic, I think across industries we can all come up with number of stories of disruption. And I think it is in these moments where communication, transparency, at least in my limited experience, have been extremely handy as a tool to deal with it.
And that's why I was keen for us to have this conversation about living and leading through disruption, because in some ways this episode will live on long after the pandemic because of its applicability to just everyday life, as you've explained in many ways. So is there a way that people could get in contact with you if they wanted to get in touch, share some wisdom or benefit from on shared learning, or there might be some themes off the back of this episode that they can follow up on? Is there a way to perhaps contact you?
Absolutely. I'm always up for a chat, Adam. My profile on LinkedIn, I think, is reasonably updated. And you have my contact details. I'll be very happy for people to contact me should they wish. Yeah,
that's absolutely, SP. Thank you very much. So here's my final question to you, which I'm asking everybody, and that I'm calling the insight. Mm-hmm. And it's really, what is the most powerful piece of leadership advice that is front of mind for you that you've either received or you've given? What comes to mind for you, SP?
So let me just start off with a slight tongue-in-cheek response. I think giving advice is also something that needs to be really carefully considered, because more often than not, unless people are ready to receive advice, it usually flows off, how do they say it? A duck off water off a duck's back.
Yes.
So I resist the temptation to give advice, because I think one really needs to be in the right frame of mind. But having said that, I think the one thing that's really helped me is to get to know your people. As you mentioned, I've had the privilege of working in many different parts of the world, working with people from different cultures, different organizations, and the one thing which I can very confidently say is, no two people are the same. You have people with different levels of competencies, with different levels of motivation, and it will be such a shame if you were to approach work with these people without knowing which buttons to press to get the best result.
Right.
So, I do spend personally a lot of time with people away from work as well in my team, simply because to get to know them at a more human level is actually a great insight into knowing how to get them to do what you want from them. Some people are extremely competent. They simply need encouragement, whereas some people need direction. So first and foremost, I would say, get to know your people, whether it's your team, whether it's your shareholders, whether it's your customers, whether it's your regulators. Get to know them at a more human level, because at the end of the day, projects are complex. my industry is a heavily regulated industry.
Yes.
Getting any project, it's not like selling toothpaste. It's you've got to really work through, sometimes create new legislation to make things happen. So you're dealing with high levels of uncertainty. And in a scenario like that, it's only through people that you can actually get to where you want to. And not knowing your people well enough will become a great impediment. So for anyone who feels that they're dependent on people and people's ways of working, I can say, great, that's a great identifying step that you've taken. Please take now the time to get to know them well, because it's only then it's only then will you be able to deliver through them.
Yeah, it's a great insight. And actually feedback, you're right. It's not advice, because advice is only really any use if someone wants it. So you're right. I think it's a lovely insight, and it really taps into the passion that I have for human-centered leadership, for one. And I think that's just such an important element that is continuing to be a theme throughout and out. So thank you so much, SP, for taking the time, connecting with me again, and being an amazing part of the Leadership Enigma. I hope you've had some fun, and I hope that you'll entertain the mere thought of coming back and joining me again at some point on the Leadership Enigma.
Join us again next week for more tips and strategies on the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with your host on LinkedIn or visit the dedicated website, www.leadersenigma.com, powered by Transform Performance International, where you can access our exclusive learning, including books, videos, bonus content, assessments, and more. Please don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms. Thanks for listening.